Hello everybody, I'm Felix Wemheuer. I'm professor for modern China studies at the University of Cologne. This is my YouTube channel Studying Maoist China, and this is the second part of a small series on the Soviet-Sino split. I put the link to the first part in the show notes. And both parts are focusing on the question, why did the Soviet and Chinese party leadership openly argued about the general line of the communist world movement, and I focus on the years of 63 when the open debate started, but it goes a little beyond it to 65. And in this part I will try to answer the question, how did question of race and identity contribute to the split of the Afro-Asian movement? And this is based on the research of others, but I also published one article in German in this edited volume on identity and politics. You can find the source also in the show notes. Here you can see also in this propaganda this unity between various races, how this was called at that time. So the Afro-Asian solidarity movement started at the Bandung conference in Indonesia in 1955 and became at least world famous at that time. And in the following, China and other newly independent countries in Africa tried to organize a second one, the big conference with many states that would have a huge global impact and also would be highly symbolic. However, a second conference with the same importance did not take place, and there were several reasons for it. First, what was the question where it would be held, and who would organize it, and two very important players in this movement were Algeria after the revolution under Ben Bella and Indonesia under President Sukarno. However, in Indonesia, right in 65, Sukarno was overthrown, and then there was this terrible purge or genocide that ended this project. And in Algeria, the military staged a coup against Ben Bella, and China lost as a result one of the most important allies in the global south about the time. In Bandung, the Soviet Union was not present, but later it tried to join the Afro-Asian solidarity movement, and the Soviet Union argued that the country had also an Asian part. Therefore, the Soviet Union would be a Eurasian country or also Asian countries and should be allowed to join. And by that time, the relation to the PRC was very bad, and China would argue, no, the Soviet Union is a European country and most of the people in the Soviet Union also would live in the European part. Therefore, the Soviet Union should not be allowed to join this movement or the conferences. The self-identity of the Soviet Union was that as a developed, industrialized country and a global superpower, but they also had a more backward part in Central Asia. So in a competition among influence of the global south, the Soviet government would promote the Central Asian republics such as Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan as models for a global south, how poorly agrarian countries also could then industrialize or developed. So the Soviet Union would not claim that the whole country would be a developing country, but they had parts that could be a model for other developing countries. So in this debate, the Soviet Union accused the Chinese government of playing the race card, that they would portray the Soviet Union as a white country to gain support against the Soviet Union among the one non-white countries. The Chinese leadership, I think, never openly argued in that way, and they would accuse the Soviet Union also of racism, that they would use a narrative of a yellow threat to isolate China. And you can easily find these arguments also in the commentaries, in addition to the open letter about the general line of the communist world movement, who here in this comment also was published in a red flag, accusing the Soviet Union of being apologist of neocolonialism and just relation to the question of racism, when they peddle theory of racism, describing the national liberation movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America as one of the colored against the white race. The leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union are clearly aiming to initiating racial hatred among the white people in Europe and North America, at diverting the people of the world from the struggle against imperialism, and at the turning the international working class movement away from the struggle against modern revisionism. So also in the comments I quote Stalin and Lenin criticizing racism, and they would more develop a very traditional Marxist-Leninist argument that class struggle would be more important than other forms of struggle. They would not frame it in any way, so the non-white people against the white. In the beginning, in Indonesia and Bantung in 1955, China was seen as part of the non-aligned movement, right? It had close relation to the Soviet Union, but it was never part of the Warsaw Treaty, the defense alliance of the Soviet Union. But very soon, China distanced itself from the non-aligned movement for several reasons. One was that Yugoslavia played a very important role in it, and also a conference of the non-aligned movement was held in Belgrade in 1961, and China considered Yugoslavia as a revisionist state. And you can also read more about in this monograph about the darker nations, a people's history of the third world, what is the history of the non-aligned movement, where it's very clear that China wanted the non-aligned movement to take a very anti-Soviet position. But countries like, for example, India, like Egypt, like Algeria, they still wanted to maintain good relations to the Soviet Union, so they were not willing to following the Chinese hardcore anti-Soviet line. So in the end, China turned away from this movement. The question of race was not only important in relation to the Afro-Asian solidarity movement, but also in relation to the US civil rights movements of the Afro-American citizens in the US that also developed in the south of the US against segregation, and then also later became like a more radical and socialist. For example, the Black Panther parties as the most famous and influential group among the black radicals. Here you can see Soviet propaganda posters condemning like segregation and the attack on the civil rights movements. This is here in Russian, so maybe it was also targeted at a Russian audience here, not at an American audience. And there, the Soviet Union, also other socialist countries, they could make their point. They could say, the US government always talks about freedom and equality, and is attacking socialist countries for the violation of civil rights. But look, at home, they would use police force and dogs against the civil rights movement. Some research have been done on a question how socialist countries in Eastern Europe built ties to the post-colonial world and anti-colonialist movements, but also to civil rights activists in the US. Also, East Germany was active in this, but also countries like Hungary and Poland. And this is an example from some years later, 69-70, when Angela Davis was in prison. She was a member of the Communist Party of the United States that was pro-Soviet. So, for example, then the GDR organized a huge solidarity campaign to free Angela Davis. And then when she was finally released from prison, she also made a tour through East Germany and was warmly welcomed by state officials. Here you can see her next to Margaret Honecker, but also by citizens. And meanwhile, like every child in the GDR would know Angela Davis, because when she was in prison, they sent postcards and letters to Angela. Here, like 100,000 roses for Angela in the form of a postcard. Also, Maoist China tried to build these links. There have been some research on it. Here you can see Mao Zedong and Du Bois in China, where he celebrated his 19th birthday. And also China would try to build these links. And the monograph, The East is Black, this is less focused on the Chinese activities, but how the radical part of the American civil rights movement would imagine China, and some also imagined China as a black country. Mao Zedong also personally intervened in the Afro-American civil rights movement during the March of Washington, led by Dr. Martin Luther King. Mao wrote an open letter to the Afro-Americans to express support. And in the same year, also the Chinese government published a polemic against the Communist Party of the United States, accusing them of being revisionist, not promoting revolution in the United States, and also they would not put enough effort to support China's struggle against colonialism. And just to give you an example how Mao would argue, this is a statement, right? His like open letter. I translated it also. Black people in Chinese is called Heiren, right? Here you can see the Chinese use the term Zungzu Qishe, use racial discrimination. So at that time they would believe race would exist and racial discrimination is bad. Like today we would more think that race as such is a construction and does not exist. So in the statement Mao wrote, I call on the workers, peasant and revolutionary intellectuals, enlightenment elements of the bourgeoisie and other enlightenment persons of all colors in the world, whether they are white, black, yellow or brown, to unite to oppose the racial discrimination practiced by US imperialism, to support the American black people in their struggle against discrimination. Here you have the idea of the very broad global united front. In the final analysis, national struggle is a matter of class struggle among the whites in the United States. It is only the reactionary ruling cycle who oppress the black people. Yeah, this is a very classic Marxist-Leninist interpretation of racism, that this is only like a trick to split the working class. And do not argue that maybe also many ordinary workers also could be racist. They, so the reactionary white elites, can in no way represent the workers, farmers, revolutionary intellectuals, and other enlightenment persons who comprise the overwhelming majority of the white people. So here class, it's more important, and of course the old hope of the Marxist-Leninist movement that they could win over also most white workers for the liberation struggle of black people in the US, but also anti-colonial struggles in the global south. So the Soviet Union and China, they all used attacks on racism in US in their narratives and their propaganda, but I think the impact also was limited. So the Soviet Union had the problem in the United States, but also in the global south, that by many activists it was perceived as a white country, right? There are also many non-white people were living in the Soviet Union in Central Asia, but the image was more like that were like Russians or Ukrainians. And also the Western propaganda, they would also accuse the Soviet Union of colonialism in their own state, right? They would exploit the periphery in Central Asia, but also would accuse the Soviet Union of racism. And in the first video, I mentioned the Lumumba University in Moscow. And so some Africans who went there, they were disappointed. They had experience with racism, and then they published books. Of course, these books were used by the Western side then to say, okay, come on, the Soviet Union is claiming that they're anti-racist, anti-colonialist, but black people who went there, they would think differently. In reality, of course, it was more complicated. There are also many positive accounts or neutral accounts about the stay in Moscow, but during the Cold War, of course, both sides would use these negative accounts to attack the other side. In this book, The East is Black, there's an argument is developed that many radical Afro-Americans, they could relate to China as long as they took a very strict anti-imperialist stand against the US. But when Nixon visited China and the Sino-US rapprochement began, some feel disappointed or even betrayed because their enemy number one was Richard Nixon. And there were also later some other factors that, for example, in the civil war in Angola, China would support with South Africa and with the United States government, then the UNITA who fought against the socialist government that was backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union. This also led to some splits in the Angola solidarity movements, even in Europe. In October of '64, something important happened. Khrushchev was overthrown and a new leadership under Brezhnev was established. It could have been a chance for reconciliation between the Chinese and the Soviet Communist Party, but this did actually not happen. Interestingly, there were some important policy changes among the new leadership under Brezhnev. So Khrushchev was in the early 1960s very enthusiastic, and he thought the Soviet Union could just enter communism within 20 years and then also overtake the United States in industrial production and even consumption by the 1980s. Then already in 1964 it was very obvious that this would not happen. The Soviet Union had massive problems also. Started to import more grain to feed the population and had more like a tense economic situation. So there by no way there would like any chance to overtake the US in a near future. And also similar what the Chinese did after the famine, instead of then more focusing on economic competition with capitalism, the Soviet Union then developed a much stronger anti-imperialist rhetoric, also to compete with China. Here we can see a Soviet propaganda poster to support Vietnam. And in 63, 64, China had promoted a hard line in Vietnam that there should be no negotiation, and the only possible way to liberate Vietnam would be like a military victory of the North in combination with the uprising in the south of Vietnam, while the Soviet Union would take more like a more moderate position with a stronger focus on negotiation. However, now in this competition about who's the toughest anti-imperialist, the Soviet Union also changed the tone but also policies. So the National Liberation Front of Vietnam, who fought the guerrilla warfare in South Vietnam, then was invited to Moscow to open a diplomatic representation. That was maybe more like a symbolic act. What was more important, starting from 65 on, the Soviet Union then provided more aid to North Vietnam than China, and this did not have an immediate impact because as long as Ho Chi Minh was alive, he would not take a very clear position in this struggle between China and the Soviet Union. But when he died, the new leadership then broke with China and then was fully dependent on the Soviet Union to continue this war until like the occupation of Cambodia was ended only in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Yeah, it would be a different story to tell you what then happened in the following years. So in the end, I like to conclude what contributed to the Sino-Soviet split in the first half of the 1960s, and I would argue that was partly also a result of the identities of these two countries and their different views on the world, what are principal contradiction and what the right strategy is. So the Soviet Union saw itself as a leader of the socialist bloc and the communist world movement that was of course questioned by China. Soviet Union saw itself as an industrialized country, a superpower, and also of the supporter of national liberation movements. As I have argued in the first part, when we use the concept of principal contradiction, the Soviet Union under Khrushchev and also under Brezhnev saw the principal contradiction between the socialist and the capitalist camp, between them and the US, and all other contradiction, for example, in the global south between liberation movements, former colonial powers, would be minor contradiction. The Soviet Union started to frame itself as a Euro-Asian country in order to join the Afro-Asian movement that was heavily fought against by China, who would argue, no, you are not an Asian country, you are a European country, you are not allowed to join. And the Soviet Union would try to get a better image in the global south, not as a white power that was the successor of Tsarist imperialism, but they would promote their Central Asian republics as model for a successful development. In the open debate, the Soviet Union emphasized again and again that the prevention of war would be very important, because now in a nuclear age, war would lead to the destruction of mankind, and socialism could only win the peaceful competition against capitalism when peace is maintained, right? This was especially the argument under Khrushchev. In many capitalist countries in the early 1960s, there was no kind of important revolutionary workers' movement, but there were communist parties, and the Soviet Union hoped that with a broad strategy of the United Front, these parties could contribute to maintain a peace and the peaceful coexistence between socialism and capitalism. As I have argued also in the first video, that the Chinese leadership saw the principal contradiction in the world not between capitalism and socialism, but between US imperialism and the revolutionary people of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The Soviet Union said, no, this is a wrong judgment, and they accused China with the overemphasis on this North-South divide. They would split the socialist camp and also these solidarity movements. When Khrushchev was dismissed from office, the new leadership strongly emphasized that also the Soviet Union would be very anti-imperialist to get off this image of revisionist and get a better image also in the global South, and actually this take then also increased the competition with China, who is more radical regarding anti-imperialism. I think the identities of the PRC was quite very different. China considered itself as part of an anti-imperialist liberation struggle. Already the revolution in 1949 had been framed by the CCP as an anti-feudal, anti-imperialist, and in the 1960s, when they were also searching for new allies in Africa among newly independent states, but also revolutionary movements, they would frame this, like you can see here on this propaganda poster, as the anti-imperialist united front of the revolutionary people in the global South against US imperialism. And in the polemic with the Soviet Union, more indirectly, and then in the speech of Lin Biao from 1965, more directly, the Chinese Communist Party framed the major or the principal contradiction in the world, not between socialism and capitalism, but between US imperialism and these liberation movements in the global South, as I explained in the first video. The Soviet Union saw the October Revolution as a universal model, but also their own model of development. And China more and more questioned this. And in 1965, you can see a clear attempt to universalize the experiences of China as a kind of model for the liberation struggle of the global villages that should encircle the global cities, while in the polemic with the Soviet Union, it was a competition who would be a better Leninist, and the Chinese comments were full of quotations from with Lenin and a very few quotation of Mao. Then, starting in 1965, you can clearly see the argument that Mao Zedong's thought and Mao's guerrilla strategy is universal, of tool that all suppressed people in the post-colonial world could use. I think the Chinese leadership was more militant regarding the question of armed struggle and so-called people's war. For example, they denied the possibility of a peaceful revolution or peaceful transformation to socialism in the developed world, and in countries like Vietnam, they argued the Vietnamese should fight the people's war against the United States until victory, while for a long time the Soviet Union had promoted a more moderate approach that included the possibilities of negotiation. However, the Soviet Union believed that, based on the judgment that the major contradiction is between socialism and capitalism, now we would live in a socialist period, while the Chinese argument was more focused on a national democratic revolution. So even in this very radical speech by Lin Biao in 1965, he did not promote Mao Zedong's thought as part of a socialist transformation that would be just start right now, but as part of a anti-imperialist, anti-feudal liberation of the global south. And of course socialism would be a stage, but it would become later. So regarding the definition of the stage, I think the Chinese version was less radical than the Soviet strategy. Already in the mid-1950s, the Chinese leadership feared that both superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, they could make deals at the cost of China and the national liberation movements. So one issue was that then Khrushchev did not give the technology to build the atomic bomb to China, and they tried to make a deal with other nuclear powers, and also the Soviet Union did not support the attack on Jinmen for a peaceful liberation of Taiwan, and China thought, okay, they only have this attitude because they are more interested to negotiate with US for peaceful coexistence, and they put not like our revolutionary efforts at the top of their agenda. So I think like this was not during the open polemic, but took place at the same time, and then was openly published in 65, when Mao developed this concept of the intermediate zones. This concept went beyond this idea that there would be a bipolar world order of these two superpowers. He argued that like in Africa and also in Europe, there would be intermediate zones, especially in Africa where the superpowers are not so strong. And here in these zones, China should try to build support and find new allies. I think this was already the forerunner of the so-called theory of the three worlds, Sangha Shidya Lun, that then was explained by Deng Xiaoping later in a meeting of the United Nations in 74, right, where you have the Soviet Union, the US as a first world, China as part of the third world, and should find allies in a second world under these smaller capitalist countries or in the colonialized parts of the world to fight against the two superpowers. You already have more or less the same framework laid out already in 64, 65. And to understand the split or different strategy of China and the Soviet Union, we also have to take into account the very fragile diplomatic status of the People's Republic in the early 1950s, where almost only socialist countries had recognized the PRC as a representative of China. And for China, so it was a question like of survival of the CCP than to get more diplomatic recognition. And in the second half of the 1950s and the first half of the 1960s, that came all for Arab, African or Asian states, with one exception, like with France. They established full diplomatic relations in 64, where you can argue this was also like an ally from the intermediate zones, because Charles de Gaulle tried to position his country somehow between the two superpowers. I think taking this into account, we can understand that China's attitude to US imperialism was closely also linked to this changing national interest. So in the first half of the 1960s, they would take a very strong and harsh line to attack US imperialism. However, of course, this changed then later when the relations with the Soviet Union became worse and worse, culminating in the border war of 669, and then with the start of the Chinese-American rapprochement, they also then changed their rhetoric. And of course then the Soviet propaganda would attack China of betraying third world revolutions to make a deal with US imperialism. But this would be a different story. So thank you a lot for your attention. Bye bye.